Henry David Thoreau decided to leave town and go live in a little house in the middle of the woods near Walden Pond, Massachusetts. There he lived for 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. And from his book, Walden, he writes this: "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life." That's one reason for going off to live in the wilderness, to set off a purpose of self-discovery, but it wasn't Moses' reason. Moses went into the wilderness because he was a murderer, and he was fleeing justice. The previous chapter in Exodus tells the story. Moses grew up as a member of the Egyptian royal family. He lived a pampered life in the palace of the Pharaoh. But everything changed the day he learned that he wasn't the person he thought he was. Moses wasn't Egyptian at all. He was a Hebrew. If you remember your Bible stories, he got adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter when she found him floating in a basket in the Nile. Later on, as Moses learned who he really was, he began to identify with the Hebrew people as they were being mistreated and enslaved by the Egyptians. And one fateful day, he came upon an overseer beating one of his people, and he lost it. And he murdered the guy. It was a spontaneous act of passion, which he came to regret, but by this time the die was cast. What was done could not be undone. He could either stay in Egypt or die, or he could flee into the wilderness and possibly live. Moses took the obvious choice, leaving behind all his wealth and privilege. He traveled eastward toward the Sinai Peninsula, across the desert region known as Midian. It's today part of Saudi Arabia. There he found work as a shepherd. He ended up marrying the boss's daughter. There's all kinds of themes with marrying the boss's daughter. And there Moses might have lived out his life in obscurity, were it not for the day God spoke to Moses from the burning bush. And that's our lesson for the day. On this particular shepherding day, Moses found himself far from Midian, in unfamiliar territory, and as he began to look around more carefully, he saw something in the distance that caught his eye. It appeared to be a fire, and he decided to check it out. Our passage reads, "As Moses led his flock, the angel of the Lord appeared in a flame of fire out of a bush. Moses said, 'I must turn aside and look at this great sight.' And as he got closer, he could see a thorn bush that seemed to be aflame, and yet its leaves and its branches were not engulfed at all. He moved in to get a better look, and then he heard his name being called, 'Moses, Moses.' And he said, 'Here I am.'" This was his encounter with the living God. He was lost and distracted and full of life's challenges, but God found him where he was and called out to him. I suppose in all of his self-absorption, he might have wandered right on by and missed this encounter. Barbara Lundblad, an emeritus preaching professor from Union Seminary, writes this: I know, and perhaps you do too, if we are honest with each other, that we have an almost endless capacity to keep on walking. We're terribly busy. Schedules can do it. We need to get someplace, go somewhere, no time to stop. We'll come back later. Rationality can keep us from turning aside. We have a hard time believing in visions. We believe more likely in a sufficient, autonomous God, a God who can keep us from stopping. God so totally other that any earthly sign could only be our own illusions. There are plenty of sound reasons to keep on walking. There's a great quote from the book The Color Purple by Alice Walker, a really good short book, by the way. And this is flowery language, so I beg your pardon in advance. One of the main characters of the book says, I think it pisses God off to walk by the color purple in a field somewhere and don't notice it. Her point, this character's point, and Lumbald's are the same. How frequently do we just keep on walking and not notice? But Moses did turn aside, and there God called to him. Barbara Brown Taylor argues that what makes Moses Moses is not his personal search for Christ, his wits, or even his religious qualification. What makes Moses Moses is nothing other than his ability to hear God's call and to be crazy enough to listen, to trust, and to follow it. She writes this: what made him Moses was his willingness to turn aside. Wherever else he was supposed to be going and whatever else he was supposed to be doing, he decided it could wait a minute. Moses could have decided he would come back tomorrow to see if the bush was still burning when he had a little more time. Only then he would not have been Moses. He would have just been some guy who got away with murder without discovering whatever else his life might have been about. Could it be that if we turned aside more often, God would speak more often, or we would hear God speaking? How hard is it for us to turn aside, to find time to come into the presence of God, to pay attention? Is this one lesson that we can learn from this time of COVID, where our distractions are fewer, our days seemingly longer, our questions so much deeper? Evelyn Underhill, a 20th century Christian writer, wrote, God is always coming to us in the sacrament of the present moment. Will we turn aside and notice that we too are on holy ground? Moses does. And God calls Moses by name and he answers, "Here I am." And then God says something remarkable. Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. It's probably not that anything is so special about that particular piece of ground. It probably looks no different than any other piece of ground in that area of the world. Sandy and arid soil, scattered rocks, dusty brushes, desert plants, utterly unremarkable, except for the fact that one of the bushes looks to Moses like it's pulsating with an inner light. What makes the place holy is that God has chosen to be present there in a visible, auditory way. It's not the plot of ground that's holy. It's God that's holy. God has come to us. To remove one's shoes in the presence of the holy is an ancient gesture of respect. As Moses does so, standing there barefoot on that sun-baked soil, he is literally grounded in a way that he wasn't before. During my seminary days, we were privileged to have among us for a 2-day retreat John Bell. He is a member of the Iona community in Scotland, and he's written some wonderful liturgies and prayers, and several of his hymns are in our hymnal, including one called Praise God for This Holy Ground, which was recommended as a possible hymn for today. Julie figured that we couldn't learn 2 new hymns in one day. So John Bell walks into the seminary chapel in blue jeans and a faded Hawaiian shirt, along with sandals, which he immediately removed. And he said something like this: "To me, speaking about God is a holy task, which means this place is holy ground. Whenever possible, I like to be barefoot in such a place. It makes me feel grounded." I thought about taking off my shoes today, because I too like to go barefoot, but I decided against it. There's something powerful in removing whatever comes between us and the sacred. So much gets between us, as poet Gerard Manley Hopkins writes, and the grandeur of God. The first line of his poem is, "The world is charged with the grandeur of God." But the remaining lines in this powerful poem revolve around the idea that human beings have been rendered incapable of perceiving this natural world, energized with the magnificence of God due to our preoccupation with world trade and commerce. For Hopkins, today, could it be tweets and screens and whatever else that occupies our time and obscures our sight? We trudge on, unaware of what is possible all around us when we do not turn aside. In this holy moment of Moses's, he's asked to remove his shoes, essentially saying, draw away any covering that has protected you. Clear away any barrier between you and the earth so your bare feet may touch and sink into this earth, this holy ground. Be literally grounded. Let the soil coat your skin. Dig into it. Find your balance here. Find your life here again. Bare feet and burning bushes, they become markers of an encounter with our God. And such an encounter shakes up our lives, and it should transform us. It certainly did Moses. What about you and me? Will we turn aside to see this great sight, to ground ourselves in the true ground, the claim that the living God makes upon all of us? Elizabeth Barrett Browning, I'm really quoting a lot of poets this morning, but this is such an incredible passage that it has inflamed and engrossed so many poets and writers over the generations. Elizabeth Barrett Browning writes, "Earth's crammed with heaven, and every common bush fire with God. But only he who sees takes off his shoes. The rest sit around and pluck blackberries and daub their faces unaware." God is ever present and always calling to us, luring us, longing for us to meet God in holy encounter, to see and embrace all of heaven, all of the sacred that surrounds us. We will not each have the same experience that Moses had. Moses was unique, as is each of us. God had a task for him. You and I may not be challenged with the liberation of an entire population from slavery, but each of us is called. There is a Hasidic tale about Rabbi Zusya. When he was an old man, he said, "In the coming world, they will not ask me, 'Why were you not Moses?' They will ask me, 'Why were you not Zusya?' Tell me what it is you plan to do with your one wild and precious life." God calls each of us to turn aside, saying, "You are my beloved child. I have work for you to do. I have a calling for you." How will we respond? We may be reluctant, suffer from self-doubt and the "who, me's," just like Moses did, offering any number of excuses. We may try to talk God out of it. Why don't you choose someone else? Someone younger, someone a little more experienced, someone more faithful, someone with far fewer obligations, someone more spiritual, someone more faithful, a better Christian than I am. Same thoughts Moses had. And in the midst of Moses voicing all of those excuses, God says, "And I will be with you." In the artwork by Abraham Wagner, you can turn to that. This is titled "Moses and the Burning Bush." The artist imagines Moses' encounter with Moses reaching up his hand to try and touch God's hand gently, gingerly, perhaps thinking that touching God's hand is a bit like sticking your finger in a socket, thus the lightning bolts. I don't know if you can see the two hands, Moses' hand and then God's hand up here.
Oh, okay.
But what I think is telling about this artwork is the angel that is gently supporting Moses with his hand on Moses' back, giving him just what he needs to do the task before him. And God says, "I will be with you." The promise is that we will not be alone, that God goes with us, and whatever task God will have us do, it is shared work. Bare feet and burning bushes. our journeys and our encounters, our working and our living, when grounded in God, will bring us back again and again to worship on God's holy mountain. May we turn aside, take off our shoes, or do whatever it is that grounds you, and see that all is holy. For it is God that is calling us and reassuring us.